Your playground? You think you can just walk in here and take what's mine? This isn't your playground anymore.
The energy backstage at Monday Night Raw was supposed to be business as usual. Producers scurrying between segments with their headsets and clipboards, wrestlers warming up in the gorilla position, makeup artists putting finishing touches on talent before they went through the curtain. It was the organized chaos that defines every WWE show, a well-oiled machine that has been perfecting its rhythm for decades. But on this particular night, that machine was about to experience a catastrophic malfunction that nobody saw coming. What started as professional tension between two of the most physically imposing athletes in WWE history would explode into something far more dangerous, far more personal, and far more chaotic than anyone could have anticipated. Brock Lesnar arrived at the arena with his usual aura of barely contained violence. The Beast incarnate has never been one for small talk or backstage camaraderie. He shows up, he destroys whoever is put in front of him, and he leaves. That's the Brock Lesnar formula, and it has made him one of the most
you think you can just walk in here and take what's mine?
History.
This isn't your playground anymore.
There was an edge to him, a tension in his massive shoulders, a hardness in his eyes that suggested something was bothering him. Paul Heyman, his longtime advocate, wasn't with him for this appearance, which was unusual in itself. Brock moved through the backstage area like a hurricane forming on the horizon, ominous and powerful, and everyone seemed to instinctively give him space. Across the venue, in another section of the sprawling backstage area, Braun Breaker was going through his pre-match routine. The son of Rick Steiner and nephew of Scott Steiner carries wrestling royalty in his blood, but he's determined to forge his own path, to create his own legacy separate from the legendary Steiner brothers. And he's been doing exactly that with a combination of raw power, surprising agility, and an intensity that reminds veterans of a young Goldberg or Batista. Breaker has been on an absolute tear through WWE, demolishing everyone in his path, and the whispers had started getting louder about him being the next big thing, the next monster heel who could carry the company into the future. The problem was that Brock Lesnar was still very much the present. He held the World Heavyweight Championship, a title he had no intention of relinquishing to anyone, especially not to some young upstart who hadn't paid the dues that Brock felt were necessary to reach that level. And therein lay the spark that would ignite the powder keg. The tension between them had been building for weeks, though most of it had happened away from the cameras. Breaker had been vocal in interviews about wanting a shot at Lesnar's championship, about believing he had what it took to dethrone the Beast. He had made comments about Lesnar being a part-timer who didn't respect the business, who showed up only when his paycheck was big enough, who held titles hostage while younger, hungrier talents were kept down. These weren't the typical scripted promos designed to build heat for an angle. These felt real, felt personal, felt like genuine frustration from a young athlete who believed his time was now and couldn't understand why the old guard wouldn't step aside. Lesnar, for his part, had largely ignored Breaker's comments publicly. But those close to him knew that Brock was aware of everything being said, and he wasn't pleased. In Lesnar's mind, Breaker hadn't earned the right to even speak his name, let alone demand a championship opportunity. The kid was good, sure, but being good wasn't enough. This business requires more than physical ability. It requires paying your dues, earning respect, understanding the hierarchy that has existed in professional wrestling since its inception. And in Brock's view, Braun Breaker hadn't done any of that yet. The collision course was set, and tonight would be the night these two forces finally met with catastrophic results. It started in catering. This area, normally a peaceful zone where wrestlers could grab food and decompress between segments, would become ground zero for what was about to unfold. Brock was standing near the craft services table, eating alone as he typically did, his massive frame making the regular-sized chair look like children's furniture. Braun Breaker entered the area with several other wrestlers, his voice carrying across the room as he talked about his recent victories, his momentum, his belief that he was ready for the main event scene. Their eyes met across the room. It was one of those moments where you could feel the temperature drop, where everyone present suddenly became aware that something was about to happen. The other wrestlers in the room began slowly edging toward the exits, reading the situation with the instincts developed from years in the business. When two alpha predators occupy the same space, smart people get out of the way. Breaker, whether from genuine confidence or youthful bravado or simply an unwillingness to show any fear, didn't look away. He held Lesnar's gaze, and something passed between them in that moment, an unspoken challenge, an acknowledgement that the verbal sparring was about to become physical. Brock stood up slowly, deliberately, his movements carrying the weight of barely controlled aggression. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. His body language communicated everything. This was his territory, his domain, and this young punk needed to learn his place. Breaker responded by squaring his shoulders and taking a step forward rather than backing down. The room held its collective breath. Then Breaker made the mistake that would light the fuse. He spoke, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, projecting in a way that suggested he wanted an audience for what he was about to say. He told Brock that the era of part-timers holding championships hostage was over. He said that guys like him, who showed up every single week and put in the work, were tired of waiting for the old generation to step aside. He said that Brock's time was done, and that championship around his waist would look better on someone who actually deserved it. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody moved, nobody breathed. Every person in that room knew that Breaker had just crossed a line that you don't cross with Brock Lesnar. You can play the tough guy in promos, you can talk trash when the cameras are rolling, but behind the scenes, you show respect. Especially to someone like Brock, who has earned his place at the top through decades of dominance. Breaker had just violated that unspoken rule, and everyone knew what was coming next. Brock moved with terrifying speed for a man his size. One moment he was standing by the table, the next he had closed the distance between them and was in Breaker's face, so close that their foreheads were almost touching. The younger man, to his credit, didn't back down, didn't flinch, stood his ground even as every survival instinct he possessed must have been screaming at him to retreat. Brock's voice when he finally spoke was low, dangerous, the kind of tone that promised violence. He told Breaker that if he wanted a piece of the beast, he could have it right now, title or no title, cameras or no cameras. Breaker's response was to shove Brock backward. It wasn't a massive shove, more of a chest bump, an assertion of dominance, a refusal to be intimidated. But it was enough. Brock's expression transformed from anger to something primal, something that went beyond professional rivalry into genuine rage. He lunged forward, and all hell broke loose. The first punch Brock threw wasn't a worked wrestling punch. It was a legitimate strike, the kind he learned in his UFC days, technical and brutal and designed to hurt. It caught Breaker on the side of the head, snapping his neck to the side and causing him to stumble backward into the wall. But Breaker was tougher than most, and he responded immediately, launching himself at Lesnar with a tackle that would have made his father and uncle proud. Both men crashed into the craft services table, sending food and drinks flying across the room in an explosion of chaos. They hit the ground hard, grappling with each other with a ferocity that made it clear this was no longer about putting on a show or working an angle. This was real. Two incredibly powerful athletes were trying to genuinely hurt each other, using every technique at their disposal. Brock, with his extensive wrestling background from his NCAA championship days and his MMA training, was trying to establish control and get into a dominant position. Breaker, equally strong and with his own amateur wrestling pedigree, was fighting to prevent that and create separation so he could use his striking power. The sound of their struggle was terrible to hear. Grunts of exertion, bodies slamming into walls and furniture, the crash of equipment being knocked over as they rolled across the floor. Other wrestlers who had remained in the area were yelling for security, for producers, for anyone who could potentially break up this fight before someone got seriously injured. Brock managed to get mount position, sitting on Breaker's chest with his weight pinning the younger man down. He reared back to throw a ground-and-pound strike, but Breakker bucked explosively, using his powerful legs to create enough momentum to throw Brock off balance. They separated for a moment, both men scrambling to their feet, circling each other like the trained fighters they were. Security personnel came rushing into the catering area, but they stopped short when they saw who was fighting. How do you break up a fight between Brock Lesnar and Braun Breaker? These weren't regular guys having a disagreement. These were two of the most physically imposing specimens in all of professional wrestling, both in peak condition, both fueled by genuine animosity. The security team seemed paralyzed by indecision, unsure how to proceed without potentially getting hurt themselves. Adam Pearce, the Raw general manager, came running into the area, his face flushed with panic and anger. He was yelling at both men to stop, threatening suspensions and legal action, and everything else he could think of to get them to cease their attack on each other. But his words had no effect. Brock and Braun were locked in their own private war, oblivious to everything else. Breakker managed to land a brutal forearm strike that connected with Brock's jaw, actually causing the beast to take a step backward. It might have been the first time in years that someone had visibly rocked Lesnar with a strike, and the shock of it seemed to register on everyone's faces. But it also seemed to make Brock angrier, more determined to destroy this young challenger who dared to stand toe-to-toe with him. Brock exploded forward with a double-leg takedown that drove Breakker backward through the doorway and out into the hallway. The fight spilled out of catering and into the main backstage corridor, where even more personnel and wrestlers had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Camera operators were scrambling to get footage, production assistants were calling for medical staff to be on standby, and wrestlers were pulling out their phones to record what was happening. The hallway gave them more room to move, and the fight evolved into something more dangerous. Brock grabbed Breakker and launched him into a stack of equipment cases, the impact echoing through the corridor like a car crash. Breakker crashed through the cases, equipment spilling across the floor, but he was up almost immediately, charging back at Lesnar with a spear that drove both men into the opposite wall with enough force to actually crack the drywall. More security arrived, and this time they attempted to intervene despite the danger. 6 large security guards rushed forward, trying to create human barriers between the two fighters. They managed to create some separation, with 3 guards restraining Brock and 3 attempting to hold back Breakker. But you could see the strain on their faces, the physical effort required to contain these 2 powerful athletes who were still trying to get at each other. Brock was screaming now, his face red with exertion and fury, telling Breakker that he had made the biggest mistake of his life, that he had no idea who he was messing with. Breakker was responding in kind, yelling that Brock was nothing but an overhyped husband who needed to accept that his time was over. The verbal assault was almost as vicious as the physical one had been, each man trying to wound the other's pride and ego. Triple H appeared on the scene, his presence immediately commanding attention. As both an executive and someone who these wrestlers respected, he had the authority to potentially end this situation. His face was a mask of controlled fury as he assessed the chaos, the damaged equipment, the destruction that had been wrought in his backstage area. He looked at both men, then began issuing orders in a voice that brooked no argument. He told security to separate them immediately, to take them to opposite ends of the building. He told producers to clear the area and to make sure no footage of this incident made it to social media until he decided how to handle it. He told both Brock and Braun that they would be meeting with him separately before the end of the night, and that there would be severe consequences for this unprofessional conduct. But even as security began to physically drag them apart, Brock and Braun continued to struggle against their restraints, continued to hurl insults and threats at each other. The animosity was palpable, the hatred real and raw and impossible to ignore. This wasn't 2 professionals working an angle to build heat for a future match. This was genuine bad blood, the kind that doesn't go away after the cameras stop rolling. As they were finally separated and taken to different areas, the backstage area remained in stunned silence. Wrestlers who had witnessed the fight stood in small groups, talking in hushed voices about what they had seen. Some were excited, recognizing that what they had witnessed would likely lead to one of the biggest matches in recent WWE history. Others were concerned, worried about the safety implications of allowing two men with such obvious animosity to work together in the ring. A few veterans shook their heads, seeing echoes of past backstage fights that had ended careers or created rifts that never healed. The production team was in crisis mode, trying to figure out how to salvage the rest of the show while dealing with this situation. Was Brock still scheduled to appear on camera tonight? Was Breaker's planned segment going to happen? How were they going to explain this to the live audience who might have heard the commotion backstage? The normally smooth operation of a WWE show had been thrown into chaos. In his temporary office, Triple H was making phone calls and holding emergency meetings with his top lieutenants. The questions were flying fast and furious. Should they suspend both men? Should they capitalize on the genuine heat between them and fast-track a championship match? Should they try to calm things down and keep them separated for a while? Every option had pros and cons, and the decision would have massive implications for the company going forward. Meanwhile, in a locker room on one end of the building, Brock was pacing like a caged animal, his hands still clenched into fists, his breathing heavy from the exertion and adrenaline. A trainer was trying to check him for injuries, but Brock kept waving him away, insisting he was fine. His mind was clearly still on the fight, replaying it, thinking about what he should have done differently, how he could have hurt Breaker more. For someone who has been at the top of this business for over 2 decades, the idea that a relative newcomer would challenge him so directly was infuriating beyond measure. In another locker room at the opposite end of the building, Braun Breaker was in a similar state. He was nursing what looked like it might become a black eye, and his shoulder was bothering him from when Brock had thrown him into the equipment cases. But there was a wild energy in his eyes, a mixture of excitement and rage that suggested the fight had only increased his desire to face Lesnar in the ring. He was telling anyone who would listen that he didn't care about suspensions or fines, that Brock had shown his true colors as a bully who couldn't handle being challenged, and that when they finally did have their match, he was going to expose the beast as being past his prime. As the show continued, rumors of the backstage fight began spreading through the arena. Fans on social media were posting that something major had happened backstage, that Brock and Braun had gotten into a legitimate fight. Within minutes, it was trending worldwide. Videos that some wrestlers and crew had managed to capture on their phones were leaking online, showing brief glimpses of the chaos. The WWE social media team was working overtime trying to contain the narrative, but in the age of smartphones and instant communication, that was nearly impossible. The wrestling media went into overdrive. Every major wrestling news site posted breaking news alerts. Podcasters who were in the middle of recording episodes stopped to discuss the developing situation. Former wrestlers were being contacted for their thoughts on what this meant for the business, whether this kind of backstage violence was acceptable, whether it was being worked or was genuinely real. The consensus seemed to be that while there were probably elements of work mixed in, the intensity and violence of what had occurred suggested genuine animosity. By the time the show went off the air, the backstage fight between Brock Lesnar and Braun Breaker had become the biggest story in wrestling. It overshadowed every match that took place that night, every scripted segment, every planned angle. The conversation was dominated entirely by speculation about what would happen next, whether these two would be allowed to face each other, whether WWE would try to capitalize on the genuine heat or would attempt to cool things down. In the following days, WWE made their position clear through official statements and through Triple H's appearance on various media outlets. Both Brock Lesnar and Braun Breaker were being fined substantial amounts for their unprofessional conduct. They were being required to undergo anger management counseling. And most significantly, they were being kept separated for the time being, with the potential match between them being teased as something that might happen in the future, but only under carefully controlled circumstances. But the statements from WWE couldn't change what had happened or the implications it carried. The mystique around both men had been enhanced in different ways. Brock's reputation as a legitimate tough guy had been reinforced, showing that, even in his 40s, he was still one of the most dangerous men in the building. Breaker's standing had paradoxically been elevated by his willingness to fight the beast, showing that he had the kind of fearlessness and toughness that main event stars need to possess. Fan polls showed overwhelming demand for a match between them. Social media engagement around both wrestlers skyrocketed. Merchandise sales for both men increased significantly. From a business perspective, the fight had been a goldmine, generating attention and interest that no scripted segment could have matched. The question was whether WWE would be willing to risk putting these two volatile personalities in the ring together, knowing that the line between work and shoot might be dangerously thin.